I am Layla, 34 years old, and I just received the most hurtful text message from my father. My hands trembled as I read his words on my screen. Stay away from my retirement celebration. Nobody wants to see your face. I scrolled down further. You have been nothing but a disappointment. Then I noticed something worse. This message wasn't sent directly to me. It was posted in our family group chat, and they were all laughing about it. I am sharing this story from my home office in Seattle. If you are watching this, let me know where you are tuning in from and hit that subscribe button. This is a story about family betrayal and how sometimes silence is your most powerful weapon. The relationship with my father has always been complicated. He was never the warm, supportive type that other kids seem to have. Instead, he was critical, demanding, and rarely satisfied with anything I accomplished. Growing up, I learned to brace myself whenever he started a sentence with my name. My mother was my buffer, my safe harbor in the storm of his temperament. She would gently redirect his criticism, highlight my achievements, and remind him that not everyone needed to follow his exact path to be successful. But when I was 15, my mother passed away after a brief but intense battle with cancer. The loss devastated our family, but it hit me particularly hard. Not only had I lost my mother, but I also lost my defender. Just a year after my mother died, my father remarried. Patricia entered our lives like she was auditioning for the role of the wicked stepmother in a fairy tale. From day one, she viewed me as competition rather than as a grieving teenager who needed guidance. She would constantly compare me to her friends' daughters, point out my flaws to my father, and make subtle digs about how I would never measure up to my father's expectations. "Your daughter lacks the discipline needed to succeed in this world, Richard," she would say within my earshot. Or, "I don't think Layla has what it takes to continue your legacy." My older brother Marcus and I used to be close. He was 4 years older than me and had always been protective. But after he married Jenna 6 years ago, everything changed. Jenna and Patricia formed an alliance, and soon Marcus began to drift away. He stopped defending me at family gatherings, started echoing my father's criticisms, and eventually became just another voice in the chorus of disappointment. "Layla, when are you going to get serious about your future?" Marcus would ask, perfectly mimicking our father's tone. "This artsy stuff isn't going to pay the bills forever." After college, I made the decision to move to Seattle to pursue my career in graphic design. It was partly because of the opportunities there, but mostly to escape the constant judgment at home. In Seattle, I could breathe. I could create without hearing how impractical my choices were. I could live without having every decision scrutinized and found wanting. Despite the distance, I tried to maintain a relationship with my family. I called regularly. I sent birthday and holiday gifts. I made the 3-hour drive back to Portland for important events. But each visit felt like walking into a performance review, where I was perpetually falling short. "Still single?" "Layla." Patricia would ask, her voice dripping with mock concern. "You know, at your age, options start to become limited." "That apartment in Seattle must be eating up all your money," my father would comment. "In business, we call that a poor investment." "Why can't you find a real job closer to home?" Jenna would chime in. "Your graphic design hobby is cute, but don't you want something stable?" Each visit left me emotionally drained, yet I kept trying. Somewhere deep inside, I hoped that one day my father would really see me, and be proud of the woman I had become. When I heard about my father's retirement celebration, I thought this might be that chance. After 30 years of building his business, he was stepping down. It was a significant milestone, and despite our difficult relationship, I wanted to be there to honor his achievement. I had even started looking at flights, planning to surprise him with my presence. That was when the text message arrived. I was sitting at my desk comparing ticket prices when my phone buzzed. A notification from our family group chat. And there it was, in plain text, my father's request that I stay away from the celebration. His declaration that no one wanted to see my face. his assessment of me as nothing but a disappointment. The words hit me like physical blows, each one stealing a little more air from my lungs. But what hurt even more was seeing the responses that followed. After the initial shock wore off, I found myself scrolling up through the group chat, reading the conversation that had preceded my father's cruel message. What I discovered made the betrayal even more profound. They had been discussing the retirement party for weeks, and the topic of my invitation had come up repeatedly. The consensus was clear. I wasn't wanted. "Do we really need to invite Layla?" Patricia had written. "She will just bring down the mood like she always does." My brother Marcus, once my protector, had responded, "She always makes everything so complicated. Remember how she questioned Dad's decision to change the company logo last year that started a whole unnecessary debate?" His wife Jenna suggested, "Maybe we could just forget to invite her. If we don't mention the party, she probably won't even know about it until after." But it was my father's response that cut the deepest. "No, I will handle Layla. Better to be direct than have her show up unexpected and ruin the evening." Then he sent the message, the one telling me to stay away. And their reactions followed Patricia. Perfect, straight to the point. Jenna. LOL, finally someone said it. Marcus. Dad coming in with the tough love. My father again. She will get over it. It's time she realized we don't always need her presence. I sat staring at my phone, feeling a hollowness spreading through my chest. The family I had been trying so hard to please, to connect with, had been actively working to exclude me. The celebration I had been planning to attend, despite knowing it would be uncomfortable, was explicitly being protected from my presence. But as I continued to read, another conversation thread caught my attention. They were discussing the sale of my father's company. This wasn't just a retirement. He was selling the business he had built over 3 decades. The business my mother had helped establish, the business I had contributed to in its early years. The buyers are offering $15 million, my father had written. The paperwork should be finalized next week. Patricia responded with excited emojis. And with Marcus as the only legally recognized heir, we don't have to worry about Layla trying to claim a portion. My breath caught. My father had always told us that the company was our family legacy. When my mother was alive, it was understood that both Marcus and I would have a stake in its future. When had that changed, and how could my father allow it? I scrolled further, my hands shaking. "Is Layla completely cut out?" Jenna asked. "She signed away her rights when she chose to pursue her art career instead of joining the company," my father replied. "At least that's what the paperwork will show." I had never signed anything of the sort. In fact, I had never been given the option to join the company in a meaningful way. After my mother died, Patricia had systematically edged me out, convincing my father that my artistic talents were of no use to the business. As I read their messages, planning to divide what should have been partially my inheritance, something shifted inside me. The hurt began to transform into something else. Determination, resolve, a cold clarity. They thought they knew me. They thought I would accept this betrayal as I had accepted all the others, with quiet hurt and eventual forgiveness. They had no idea what I was capable of, and they certainly had no idea what was coming. As the shock of my father's message and the group's betrayal settled into a dull ache, memories began to surface. Memories of my contributions to the family business that had apparently been erased from the collective narrative. My father's company, Westbrook Design Solutions, hadn't always been the successful enterprise it was today. In its early days, it was a struggling small business operating out of a converted garage. I was just 13 when my father started the company, but even then I was involved. "Layla, what do you think of this?" my father had asked, showing me his first attempt at a company logo. Back then he still valued my artistic eye. "It looks like every other construction company logo, Dad," I had told him honestly. "You need something that stands out." I spent that weekend designing alternatives, and the logo he ultimately chose, my design, became the face of the company for the next 15 years. As I entered high school, my responsibilities grew. I designed their first website, created all their marketing materials, and spent countless hours helping my mother, who handled the administrative side of the business, organize files, and manage correspondence. During my first 2 years of college, I worked for the company without pay, coming home every weekend to update their materials and create presentations for potential clients. It was my mother who insisted I receive credit for my work. "Richard, you need to acknowledge Layla's contributions," she had told my father one evening. "She deserves to be recognized as part of this company's story." My father had agreed, albeit reluctantly. "Fine, put her name on the team page of the website. But don't make a big deal about it. She's still just helping out, not a real employee." After my mother died and Patricia entered the picture, things changed rapidly. My contributions were minimized, then forgotten. Patricia had her nephew, a mediocre graphic design student, redo all my marketing materials. My name disappeared from the website. The story of the company's founding was rewritten to exclude both my mother and me. "The company needs a more professional image," Patricia had explained when I questioned the changes. "No offense, Layla, but your work looks amateur." But now, as I delved deeper into the group chat and started searching through my emails, I discovered something even more disturbing. My father wasn't just retiring. He was selling the company to Redstone Enterprises, their biggest competitor, for $15 million. Redstone had a notorious reputation in the industry. They would buy smaller companies, strip them of their assets, and lay off most of the employees. The people who had worked loyally for my father for decades would likely be out of jobs within months of the sale. And according to the messages, I was being deliberately cut out of any financial benefit from this sale. There were references to paperwork that would prove I had relinquished my claim to the company years ago, paperwork I knew I had never signed. I dug through my old files and emails, searching for evidence of my involvement in the company. I found dozens of emails from clients praising my design work. I found old contracts for projects I had managed. And then, buried in a folder of scanned documents, I found something crucial. When I was 22, just before my mother became ill, she had insisted that my father formalize my position in the company. There was a legal agreement signed by both my parents, stating that I owned 25% of Westbrook Design Solutions in recognition of my ongoing contributions to the business. My father had clearly forgotten about this document, or perhaps he believed all copies had been destroyed after my mother passed. Patricia certainly would have made sure any copies in the company files disappeared. But my mother, always cautious, had sent me my own copy for safekeeping. "Keep this somewhere safe, sweetheart," she had told me. "Hopefully you will never need it, but it's important to protect yourself, even from family sometimes." At the time, I hadn't fully understood her caution. Now her foresight seemed almost prophetic. With trembling hands, I called my friend Sophie, who had become a corporate lawyer since our college days together. "Layla, what they are trying to do is illegal," she told me after I explained the situation. "If you have documentation of your ownership stake and proof that you never relinquished it, you have a strong case." "What should I do?" I asked, still reeling from the discovery. "Gather every piece of evidence you can find," Sophie advised. "Emails, contracts, the ownership agreement, anything that proves your involvement in the company. And don't confront them yet. Element of surprise is on your side right now." I spent the next several hours compiling evidence, creating a timeline of my contributions to Westbrook Design Solutions, and making copies of the ownership agreement. As I worked, the pain of betrayal began to harden into resolve. They might have tried to erase me from the company's history, but they couldn't erase the legal documentation of my rights. I also reached out to Thomas Jenkins, who had been the company's financial officer during my mother's time and had retired 3 years ago. Thomas had always been kind to me and had often expressed disapproval of the way Patricia was changing the company's culture. "I am not surprised," Thomas said when I called him. "Patricia has been planning this for years, Layla. She convinced your father that you had abandoned the company when you moved to Seattle, that you didn't deserve a share because you weren't willing to work for it." "But that's not true," I protested. I offered to continue doing the design work remotely, and Dad said he preferred to keep things in-house. I know, Thomas sighed. I was there for that conversation. Patricia twisted it later told your father you had refused to help unless you could do it on your terms. Richard, your father has always been easily influenced by the people closest to him. Your mother used to be his moral compass. After she died. He didn't need to finish the thought. After my mother died, Patricia became that influence, and her moral compass pointed in a very different direction. There is something else you should know, Thomas added. The deal with Redstone includes a provision that would allow your father to present the sale as a merger to the employees until after the papers are signed. The employees have no idea they will likely be let go within months. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. It was about dozens of loyal employees who were about to be blindsided. Thank you, Thomas, I said. I think I know what I need to do now. After hanging up, I called Sophie back. I need to stop this sale, I told her. Not just for me, but for everyone who works there. Can you help me? It won't be easy, Sophie warned. But with your ownership documentation and the evidence of them trying to defraud you, we have leverage. Let me make some calls. Over the next few days, I transformed my pain into action. The text message that was meant to crush me instead became the catalyst for reclaiming what was rightfully mine and protecting those who had been loyal to my family business. My first call was to Sophie, who immediately began preparing legal documents to assert my ownership rights and potentially block the sale to Redstone. Based on the agreement you found, you own 25% of the company, Sophie explained. That might not be enough to block the sale entirely, but it's enough to force them to acknowledge your stake and include you in any proceeds. It also gives us standing to investigate the terms of the sale. Sophie recommended that I not confront my father or the rest of the family directly yet. Right now, they don't know what you know, she said. That gives us time to prepare properly. While Sophie worked on the legal angle, I contacted several investors I had met through my design work in Seattle. Many of them had expressed interest in expanding their portfolios, and I thought they might be interested in an alternative deal that would preserve the company and its employees. A $15 million acquisition is significant, said James Harrington, a venture capitalist who had hired me to design materials for several of his startups. But if what you are saying about Redstone's intentions is true, the company is worth more as an ongoing concern than as parts to be stripped down. I explained my history with the company and my desire to see it continue, perhaps with new leadership, but with the core team intact. Send me the financials and a business plan, James said. If the numbers make sense, I might be able to put together a consortium of investors to make a competing offer. I reached out to Thomas again, who still had contacts within the company and access to recent financial reports. What he provided confirmed my suspicions the company was actually undervalued at $15 million. Redstone was getting a bargain because my father was eager to retire, and Patricia was pushing for a quick sale. Meanwhile, I began contacting key employees of Westbrook Design Solutions, people who had been with the company for years and would be most affected by a takeover by Redstone. I was careful not to cause panic or breach any confidentiality, but I wanted to gauge their feelings about the company's future. Layla's asking questions about Dad's retirement plans, Marcus texted in the family group chat. Should we be worried? She's probably just fishing for an invitation, Patricia replied. Ignore her. She can't do anything to affect the deal. How wrong they were. By the end of the week, Sophie had prepared all the necessary legal documentation to assert my ownership rights. James and his investment partners had reviewed the financial information and were interested in making a competing offer that would keep the company intact and retain the employees. We need to move quickly, Sophie advised. Based on the messages you showed me, they are planning to finalize the deal right after your father's retirement party. So what do we do? I asked. I think it's time you crash that party, Sophie said with a smile. But not alone. We are going to make an entrance. The day before the retirement celebration, I received another text from my father. Just a reminder that your presence is not required or desired tomorrow. The family is united on this. I did not respond. Let them think their message had worked. Let them believe I was too hurt to fight back. They would soon discover how wrong they were. That night I laid out my outfit for the next day, a tailored navy blue suit that projected confidence and professionalism. Not the hurt daughter, but the businesswoman they had refused to see. I rehearsed what I would say, practiced keeping my voice steady, even as I imagined their shocked faces. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sophie asked during our final preparation call. "It's not too late to handle this purely through legal channels." "I am sure," I said firmly. They excluded me from this celebration because they thought I would make a scene, be emotional, embarrass them. I want to show them exactly who I am, someone they should never have underestimated. The plan was set. Everything was in motion. As I drove the 3 hours from Seattle to Portland, I replayed every slight, every dismissal, every moment when my family had made me feel less than. But I also thought about the loyal employees of Westbrook Design Solutions, many of whom had known me since I was a child and had always treated me with kindness. I arrived at the Riverview, one of Portland's most exclusive restaurants, an hour after the celebration had begun. Through the windows, I could see the gathering inside. My father stood at the front of the private dining room, glass raised in a toast. Patricia beside him, beaming with pride, as if the company had been her life's work, rather than something she had married into. Marcus and Jenna were at a table near the front, nodding along to whatever my father was saying. Taking a deep breath, I checked my appearance one last time in the car mirror. My dark hair was pulled back in a sleek, professional style. My makeup was subtle but perfect. I looked confident, capable, every inch the businesswoman they had refused to acknowledge I could become. "Ready?" Sophie texted. "Ready," I replied. I entered the restaurant and approached the hostess. "I am here for the Westbrook retirement celebration," I said calmly. "Of course," she smiled. "And your name?" "Layla Westbrook," I replied, "daughter of the guest of honor." Her eyes widened slightly. "Oh, I was told the immediate family had already arrived." "There was a misunderstanding," I said smoothly. "Could you show me in? I would prefer not to interrupt my father's speech." She led me to the private dining room, just as my father was reaching the emotional climax of his address. And so as I passed the torch to the new owners, I want to emphasize that family and integrity have always been the cornerstones of Westbrook Design Solutions. He was saying, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine emotion. "Everything I have built, I built for my family, for the legacy that will continue through my son Marcus." I stood silently at the back of the room, observing. The crowd included business associates, longtime clients, and employees, many of whom I recognized. Near the bar, I spotted Thomas, who gave me a subtle nod. "It hasn't always been easy," my father continued. "There have been sacrifices along the way, but I know that the decision to sell to Redstone Enterprises is the right one for our company's future." At a table near the front sat Harold Redstone himself, smiling smugly. I knew from my research that once the acquisition was complete, he planned to absorb Westbrook's client list, sell off its equipment, and retain less than 20% of the staff. My father raised his glass. "So here is to family, to legacy, and to the future of what we have built together." As applause filled the room, Patricia's gaze drifted toward the back and landed on me. Her face froze in shock, then quickly hardened into anger. She nudged my father, whispering urgently in his ear. He turned, glass still raised, and saw me. For a moment we locked eyes across the room. I saw the progression of emotions on his face: surprise, confusion, anger, and then something else. Uncertainty. Patricia started making her way toward me, clearly intending to remove me before I could cause a scene. But before she could reach me, one of the company's longest-serving employees, Grace Wilson, spotted me. "Layla!" she exclaimed loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "You made it after all, Richard. You didn't tell us Layla was coming." All eyes turned to me. Patricia reached my side and gripped my arm. "You need to leave," she hissed. "You were not invited, and you are embarrassing your father." "Actually, Patricia," I said loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I believe I have every right to be at my father's retirement celebration, especially given my stake in the company." My father's face paled. Marcus was making his way toward us now, his expression a mix of anger and panic. Just then the doors opened again and Sophie entered, followed by James Harrington and two other investors. The timing was perfect. "Ms. Westbrook," James called out. "Sorry we are late. Traffic from the airport was terrible." Patricia looked confused. "Who are these people?" she demanded. Before I could answer, Grace spoke up again. "Richard, since Layla is here, she should say a few words too. After all, she designed the original logo and all the early marketing materials that helped put Westbrook on the map." There were murmurs of agreement from other longtime employees. My father looked trapped, aware that refusing would appear strange to the gathered crowd. "Of course," he said stiffly. "Layla, would you like to say something?" Patricia shot him a furious look, but it was too late. I was already moving toward the front of the room, Sophie and the investors taking seats at a vacant table. As I took my place at the podium, I looked out at the faces watching me. Some confused, some curious, some openly supportive. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear. Jenna was frantically texting, probably updating their group chat about this unexpected development. Harold Redstone was frowning clearly, wondering who I was and why I mattered. "Thank you, Dad," I began, my voice steady. "For those who don't know me, I am Layla Westbrook. While I haven't been as visible in recent years, I was actually integral to the early development of Westbrook Design Solutions." I paused, letting that sink in. Many of you might remember the original logo and brand identity I designed while still in high school elements that helped establish our company's reputation for quality and creativity. Several people nodded, including some of the longtime clients. I say our company because despite what some might believe, I am not just Richard's daughter. I am a 25% owner of Westbrook Design Solutions, a fact established in a legal agreement signed by both my parents when I was 22 in recognition of my ongoing contributions to the business. The room went silent. My father clutched the edge of his chair. Patricia looked like she might faint. "I recently learned about the planned sale to Redstone Enterprises," I continued. "While I understand my father's desire to retire, I have concerns about what this sale would mean for the loyal employees who have helped build this company, many of whom would likely lose their jobs within months of the acquisition." Harold Redstone stood up. "This is preposterous, Richard. Who is this woman, and why is she spreading lies about our agreement?" I smiled at him calmly. "Mr. Redstone, I am not spreading lies. I am stating facts that can be verified. And as a significant shareholder in Westbrook Design Solutions, I have a legal right to be informed about and potentially object to any sale that I believe is not in the best interest of the company." I gestured to where Sophie and the investors sat. "That's why I have brought an alternative proposal. These gentlemen represent a consortium of investors interested in acquiring Westbrook Design Solutions at a competitive price with guarantees to maintain the current workforce and continue the company's legacy as established by my father and my late mother." The buzz in the room grew louder. Employees exchanged hopeful glances. My father looked shell-shocked. Patricia was whispering furiously to Marcus, who seemed equally stunned. "I don't wish to disrupt my father's celebration further," I concluded. "But I do want everyone here to know that Westbrook Design Solutions has always been more than just a company to me. It is part of my heritage, a living tribute to both my parents' work and something I believe deserves to continue thriving rather than being dismantled." I stepped away from the podium to unexpected applause led by Grace and the other longtime employees. As I walked back to where Sophie waited, Harold Redstone cornered my father. "You told me all family members were on board with this sale," he hissed loud enough for those nearby to hear. "If she owns 25% and objects, this complicates things significantly." My father looked from Redstone to me, then to Patricia, who was practically vibrating with rage. For perhaps the first time since my mother died, he looked uncertain about which way to turn. Thomas approached me, shaking my hand firmly. "Well done, Layla. Your mother would be proud." "Thank you," I said, emotion finally threatening to break through my composed facade. "That means everything to me." As the celebration continued in a much subdued fashion with clusters of people whispering and speculating, I knew the battle wasn't over. But I had accomplished what I came to do. I had made it impossible for them to pretend I didn't exist or that I had no claim to my family's legacy. My father eventually made his way over to where I stood with Sophie and the investors. His face was a mask of controlled anger. "We need to talk," he said stiffly. "Privately." I nodded. "Yes, we do. But not today. Today is your celebration, and I wouldn't want to ruin it." The irony of throwing his own logic back at him wasn't lost on either of us. "My lawyer will contact you tomorrow to discuss next steps." As he walked away, I caught Marcus watching me, an unreadable expression on his face. For a moment I thought I saw a glimmer of something like respect in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar distance. The evening continued, but the joyful atmosphere my father had carefully cultivated was gone. Instead, there was tension, speculation, and for the Westbrook employees, a new sense of hope that their jobs might be secure after all. As I prepared to leave, Grace hugged me tightly. "I always knew you were Catherine's daughter through and through," she whispered, referring to my mother. She never let anyone push her around either. In that moment, surrounded by the people who had known my family longest, who remembered my mother's contributions and my early involvement in the company, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't experienced in years. Not because my father had finally accepted me, but because I had finally accepted myself and the legacy I deserved to claim. The week following my father's retirement celebration was a whirlwind of meetings, legal discussions, and revelations. The sale to Redstone was effectively on hold, while my ownership stake was verified, and new negotiations took place. I rented a hotel room in Portland rather than returning to Seattle. I needed to be present for what came next, both legally and emotionally. The morning after the party, I received a flood of text messages from the family group chat. "Patricia, how dare you ambush us like that? Your father is devastated." Marcus, "You could have handled this privately instead of embarrassing the family." Jenna, "Always have to make everything about you, don't you?" My father remained conspicuously silent in the group, but he did send me a private message. "My office, 2 p.m. today. Bring your lawyer if you must." I forwarded the message to Sophie. "Ready for round 2? I asked. "Absolutely," she replied. "But remember, stay calm, no matter what they say. This is business now, not family drama." At 2 o'clock sharp, Sophie and I walked into my father's office at Westbrook headquarters. He wasn't alone. Patricia sat beside him with Marcus on his other side. Their lawyer, a stern-looking man I recognized as my father's golf buddy Lawrence Bennett, completed their side of the table. "Layla," my father acknowledged stiffly. "And Ms. Sophie Hernandez," my friend introduced herself professionally. "Counsel for Ms. Westbrook." "Let's cut to the chase," Lawrence began. "You claim to have documentation proving you own 25% of Westbrook Design Solutions. We need to see this documentation." Sophie calmly opened her briefcase and removed a folder. "Here is the original ownership agreement signed by Richard and Catherine Westbrook when Layla was 22, transferring 25% ownership in recognition of her significant contributions to the company's growth and success." My father took the document, his face betraying no emotion as he reviewed it. "Catherine's idea," he muttered almost to himself. "I had forgotten about this." "Convenient," Patricia snapped. "I also have copies of numerous emails, contracts, and design files documenting Layla's work for the company over many years," Sophie continued, "as well as testimony from former CFO Thomas Jenkins confirming that Layla never relinquished her ownership stake as has been claimed." Marcus leaned forward. "Even if this agreement is valid, which we are not conceding it doesn't give Layla the right to block a sale that the majority shareholders approve. True, Sophie agreed. But it does give her the right to due process to be informed of any potential sale and to receive her fair share of the proceeds. It also gives her standing to investigate whether the sale is being conducted in good faith and in the best interests of all shareholders. What exactly do you want, Layla? My father finally asked, looking directly at me. I met his gaze steadily. I want what Mom would have wanted. For the company to continue, for the employees to keep their jobs, and for the legacy you built together to remain intact. Sentimentality has no place in business, Patricia interjected. Richard built this company, and he has the right to sell it as he sees fit. Actually, Mrs. Westbrook, Sophie corrected her. Richard, Catherine, and Layla built this company according to the legal documentation and numerous witness statements we have gathered, and as a significant shareholder, Layla has rights that cannot be simply ignored because they are inconvenient. My father sighed heavily, suddenly looking every bit his 68 years. The Redstone deal is the most straightforward. They are offering cash, no complications. Except for the complication that they plan to dismantle the company and fire most of the staff, I pointed out. Which is why I have brought an alternative. I explained the proposal from James Harrington's investment group. They were offering a competitive price with better terms for continued operation and employee retention. The deal would allow my father his retirement funds while preserving what he and my mother had built. This is ridiculous, Patricia fumed. These investors don't know our business. Redstone has been in the industry for decades. Yes, and they have a reputation for destroying the companies they acquire, I countered. Is that really how you want Westbrook Design Solutions to be remembered, as another casualty of corporate acquisition? Lawrence cleared his throat. Regardless of the comparative merits of these offers, Ms. Westbrook's ownership stake is a legal reality we need to address. If this agreement is valid, and it appears to be proceeding with any sale without her consent, could create significant legal complications. The meeting continued for another hour with proposals and counterproposals discussed. By the end, it was clear that the Redstone deal as originally planned was dead. My father agreed to consider the alternative offer and to meet with James and his partners later in the week. As Sophie and I prepared to leave, my father asked me to stay behind for a moment. After everyone else had left the room, we sat in silence for a long minute. Why did you never mention this agreement? He finally asked. Would you have listened? I countered. After Mom died, anything I said was dismissed. Patricia made sure of that. He looked away, unable to deny the truth of my words. I never intended to cut you out entirely, he said quietly. Things just evolved that way. Things don't just evolve, Dad. People make choices. You chose to believe Patricia when she said I wasn't interested in the company. You chose to exclude me from family decisions. You chose to send that text. The mention of the text message made him wince. I shouldn't have sent that, he admitted. It was cruel. Yes, it was. I agreed, refusing to soften the truth to spare his feelings. But in a way, I'm grateful. Without that text, I might never have seen the group chat. I might never have known about the sale or discovered what was really happening. Another silence stretched between us, filled with years of misunderstandings and missed opportunities. Your mother always said you were the strongest of all of us, he said finally. I never really understood what she meant until now. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was perhaps the closest thing to acknowledgement I had received from him in years. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. The new logo, the one Patricia had her nephew design, it's nowhere near as good as yours was. I couldn't help but smile slightly. I know, I said simply and walked out. Over the next few days, the alternative deal took shape. James and his partners met with my father and were persuasive about their vision for Westbrook Design Solutions' future. They wanted to keep the core business intact, while expanding into new markets, leveraging the company's strong reputation and experienced staff. Marcus surprisingly became an advocate for the New Deal once he understood that it would actually value the company higher than Redstone's offer. His stake would be worth more, and there was a place for him in the new organization if he wanted it. Patricia remained bitterly opposed, but she was increasingly isolated in her position. When the employees learned about the two competing offers and what each would mean for their futures, they rallied behind the alternative that would preserve their jobs. 10 days after the retirement celebration, the New Deal was approved. My father would receive the retirement payout. He wanted the company would continue under new ownership with most of the current management team intact, and the employees' jobs were secure. As part of the agreement, I would receive my fair share of the sale proceeds, and was offered a position as creative director if I wanted to return to Portland. It was a vindication of everything my mother had believed about my talents and contributions. The evening after the final papers were signed, Marcus came to see me at my hotel. It was the first time we had spoken one-on-one in years. "I owe you an apology," he said, looking uncomfortable. "I should have stood up for you. After Mom died, it was just easier to go along with whatever Dad and Patricia wanted." "Easier for you," I pointed out. "Not for me." He nodded. "I know. I convinced myself you were fine, that you had your own life in Seattle and didn't need us. But that's not the same as not wanting us, is it?" "No," I agreed. "It's not. I let Jenna influence me too much," he admitted. "She's always been jealous of you, of how smart you are, how talented. It was simpler to side with her than to defend you and deal with her complaints afterward. It wasn't a great excuse, but at least it was honest." "And now," I asked, "now I see more clearly. What you did standing up to all of us, finding another buyer, protecting the employees, that took courage. Mom would have been proud." The mention of our mother brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "I hope so," I said quietly. Marcus hesitated, then asked, "Will you take the creative director position? Come back to Portland?" I shook my head. "No. I have built a life in Seattle. Good clients, good friends. But I will consult for Westbrook, help guide the rebranding under the new ownership." He nodded, looking slightly disappointed but understanding. "We could try to have dinner sometimes when you're in town for business. Maybe work on being brother and sister again, not just business associates." It was a small olive branch, but a genuine one. "I would like that," I said. And I meant it. As for my father, our relationship remained complicated. The text message had revealed the truth of how he saw me, and that couldn't be unseen. But in the aftermath of the failed sale and the New Deal, something had shifted. There was a grudging respect in his eyes when he looked at me now, an acknowledgement that I was more than he had allowed himself to see. Patricia remained hostile, but with the business transaction complete, and my legal rights established, her power to influence family dynamics was diminished. She had shown her true colors too clearly for even my father to ignore. I returned to Seattle with a sense of closure I hadn't expected to find. The pain of that text message and the betrayal it represented would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined me. A year has passed since that text message changed everything. I am still in Seattle, still running my design firm, but now I also serve as a consultant for Westbrook Design Solutions. The company is thriving under its new leadership, expanding into new markets while maintaining the quality and integrity that my parents established. The healing process with my family has been slow and uneven. My relationship with my father remains formal but civil. We speak on the phone once a month, careful conversations that skirt around deeper emotions, but allow us to maintain some connection. He has never directly apologized for the text or the years of dismissal that preceded it, but there is an understanding between us that things will be different going forward. Marcus and I have gradually rebuilt something resembling a sibling relationship. He separated from Jenna 6 months ago, a decision that seemed to free him to reconnect with parts of himself that had been suppressed during their marriage, including his relationship with me. We meet for dinner when I'm in Portland for business, and the awkwardness is slowly giving way to glimpses of the closeness we once shared. Patricia remains in my father's life, but has largely removed herself from mine. She avoids events where I will be present and has stopped commenting on my choices. It's a cold peace, but peace nonetheless. The employees of Westbrook, particularly those who had known me since childhood, have become an unexpected source of connection to my past. Grace especially has become a surrogate aunt of sorts, sending me updates about the company and sharing stories about my mother that keep her memory alive. Thomas Jenkins, now fully retired, has become a mentor and friend. "Your mother always knew you would need to fight for your place," he told me recently. "She tried to prepare the way, but she knew Patricia would try to erase her influence after she was gone. That's why she insisted on that ownership agreement." The pain of betrayal never fully disappears, but it has transformed into something else. Wisdom, resilience, a deeper understanding of my own strength. I no longer seek my father's approval or try to prove my worth to those who refuse to see it. Instead, I have built a circle of friends and colleagues who value me for exactly who I am. Sophie remains my closest friend and continues to handle my legal affairs. James Harrington has become a valuable business contact, connecting me with clients who appreciate my design aesthetic and business acumen. My design firm has grown, and I now employ 3 other designers, creating a small but vibrant creative team. The money from the sale of Westbrook gave me financial security I had never known before, at allowing me to be more selective about the clients I take on and the projects I pursue. I have used some of it to establish a scholarship for young women interested in design and business, a way of creating the kind of support I wished I had had. Perhaps the most important lesson I learned from that devastating text message was the power of silence. Not the silence of submission or avoidance, but the strategic silence that allows you to gather your strength, assess your options, and act from a position of power rather than pain. When my father wrote, "Stay away from my retirement celebration. Nobody wants to see your face. You have been nothing but a disappointment," he expected me to react emotionally, to plead or argue or retreat in hurt. By staying silent, by refusing to engage on his terms, I changed the dynamic between us forever. Sometimes the people who should love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. Family betrayal cuts in ways that other betrayals cannot, because it undermines the very foundation of who we believe ourselves to be. But in surviving that pain and refusing to let others' definitions limit me, I found a strength and clarity I might never have discovered otherwise. If you are facing a similar betrayal, know this: your worth is not determined by those who fail to see it. Your voice matters even when others try to silence it. And sometimes the text message meant to break you becomes the very thing that sets you free. Have you ever had to stand up to family who underestimated you? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more tales of overcoming family drama and finding your own voice. Thank you for listening, and remember that sometimes the greatest power comes from knowing when to stay silent and when to finally speak your truth.